If you would turn with me to number 71. We're going to sing everybody in and get started on that. We're a little past time, but that's okay. 71. There is none like him, none can compare. No God his equal, no prince his heir. Lift up your eyes and see his great might. Soar like an eagle on wings of flight. Saints, lift your voices, though dark your days. Lift up your spirit.
What happens after lunch? Well, I sure enjoyed being with you today. Just appreciate this opportunity and getting to be with you and us having lunch together and getting to know some of you better that I have not known. And I really enjoyed being with John and his wife today, getting to meet him and to hear him. And I really appreciate him. And we were talking about from being in Belize. I've been wanting to go to Belize and get involved in that work for last 15 years now. But so I'm just so thrilled and encouraged by them and their work, what they're doing too now here. It's funny how things work out. You never know about God's providential workings in your life and where you may be and where he may lead you to. I never thought I'd really, move north of the Mason-Dixon line. Nothing against any Yankees or anything, but I'm just a, Alabama boy. But I was in Florida, in Jacksonville, and I wouldn't be anywhere without, I'm sorry, Jeff, my wife is needing some assistance. I don't know what it could be. She's okay, probably. Anyway, I'm sorry. She couldn't get in. Anyway, locked her out. But anyway, it was funny. How long has it been now? It's been I would say 14 years. You know, here I am in Jacksonville and preaching and a little local congregation there in South Jacksonville. And then there we had some good friends, some of my best friends there. And he introduced me one day, and I met this guy for lunch, this guy I'd never known before, Bill Smith. And, you know, one thing just led to another. And then I ended up here in Virginia. So it's just funny, isn't it? How things go, and you never know who might come into your life tomorrow that might make a very dramatic change in your life. And I do appreciate Bill, and then get to meet Art, and then all of you here. And you've meant a lot to me the last 14 years. And so I just appreciate in this fellowship as a real encouragement and blessing to me. Now, I'm going to ask you this afternoon, turn in your Bibles. You want to go ahead and turn to Isaiah chapter 40. And I'm going to try to be a little bit more practical. If there's any kind of negative criticism I have about my own lesson this morning, is that it's kind of too technical and it's kind of negative. I mean, it is pretty negative. We're looking at all these oppositions to the Bible, you know, and but we sometimes have to deal with that because it's out there and we're confronting that, and we need to, like I said, we've got to be prepared, find some way that we can plant a seed into the hearts of those whose lives are dominated by pagan religions, and because they're prominent and dominant, and they're becoming increasingly more so in our country now, in our culture, society, in our neighborhoods. I mean, even the little town of Harrisonburg, we have people I've met from Russia and India and Jordan, and so many places, and then a large Hispanic community, and so it's opening new doors, but at the same time it's challenges because we're not used to maybe some of those, or we weren't. When I grew up in the Birmingham area, we weren't used to having to deal with really any of that. We didn't have to deal with evolution or, very little atheism around us. I don't remember, I knew one friend I had in middle school and, for a couple of years who was, his dad was a psychiatrist, and so he was atheist and evolutionist, he claimed. But, other than that, my friends didn't act like they were believers all the time, but they claimed to be, and they had a very strong religious community, and we had morning Bible studies at school. And anyway, we're just in a different world now, aren't we? And so we've got to find a way to develop new methods of teaching and bringing people to Christ. And it's tough. It is negative. It really is this kind of grind your teeth kind of thing. Just like Paul, remember, there he was at Mars Hill in Acts 17, and when he saw the city given totally to idolatry, what does it say? He was stirred in spirit. I mean, it was much easier, I bet, for Paul to go in the Jewish synagogues, even though that was a big challenge. But he could at least read the prophets to them, and he could teach. But these people in Athens, they had no idea about the true living God. So that's what we're facing now, people like that, our friends and neighbors we work with, go to school with. And so these are the challenges. And so I hope that maybe the lesson this morning was just more thought-provoking and challenging to you to think about, hey, we need to be able to help our people in our congregations to learn how to teach Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists. And, that's not going to be easy, but we can do it. I mean, the gospel, if we believe it, it has the power. I mean, they did it in the first century. They converted pagans and those that worshiped idols. And we can do it today if we have faith and trust in God. And that's what we're talking about today, who we're talking about. We're talking about God and giving God the glory and recognizing the great God that we do serve, from the creation, from the Scriptures. And no matter what the attacks are from without or within, we serve a great, almighty God, a supreme being, the ruler of the universe. And I'm giving away my sermon because here's what we're going to talk about. Isaiah chapter 40. But again, let me review a couple of things. I mean, we're talking about, well, is there a God? You know, we've got to confront people with that to begin with nowadays and sometimes. And so what is he like? Has he made himself known to us? And so we have, you know, God's revelation from nature, and maybe that's a place we need to start with some of the atheists or agnostics, evolutionists. But then we get into bringing people to believe in the Bible, the inspiration of the Bible, that it's the revelation from the mind of God. And so we went over these scriptures this morning. The Word of God, show people that the Word. But now Isaiah 40, I want to talk about this great God, the incomparable greatness of Jehovah God. That, let's just look here, and I appreciate us leading that, or Jeff leading that song. That was because that's what that song is taken from this chapter, from Isaiah 40 here. So let me get there, Isaiah chapter 40, and if you come down there to verse 21, there's some of the words from the song. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? These are rhetorical questions. You know, asking you about God. You know, yes, you have. You can just look at the material universe in which we live. You can look at the cosmos. You can look at the stars and the planets. I mean, you can know. You know, you don't have to have somebody to tell you all this again. But these things, they knew. The Jews knew these. And these chapters, Isaiah 40, through the next several chapters, is just describing the nature of God. And it's just describing the fact there is none like him. Verse 25, to whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal, says the Lord. And that's what he's arguing for throughout these next several chapters. Is all these idols that the heathen worship, all these pagan religions and their gods, they are nothing like the God of the Bible that's revealed to us from Genesis 1 and forward by the inspired writers. He is in a class all by himself. He is the great, incomparable Jehovah God that we serve. And these idols of the nations and other peoples are nothing compared to him. Indeed, they are nothing. They do not exist. And so these chapters, you can imagine, would be a great source of encouragement and comfort to the Jewish people as they go into captivity. Babylonian captivity is, well, they had the Assyrian threat, and the 10 tribes, of Israel went into Assyrian captivity, and then the Babylonian captivity, and they're going to be over there for 70 years, and the temple and the city in Jerusalem is destroyed. And here they are in a heathen, pagan land. Can you imagine the kind of doubts you have? Well, where is God? What is God doing? Why isn't he keeping his promises? Like John said this morning, God is faithful. And that's what we've got to learn. And remember, no matter what our circumstances is, no matter what trials or afflictions, no matter how hard the life gets, these are words that are encouraging us. In fact, go back to the first verse of Isaiah 1. It says, comfort my people. This is a message of comfort. How? To know God, to know who God is, to know of his incomparable greatness, to know of his almighty power, to know what God can do for you in any and every circumstance. I once saw a sign out in front of a church building on a marquee. I don't remember what kind of church, but it said, in time of trouble, read Isaiah 40. And ever since then, I've thought about that. In my time of trial and trouble or worry, anxiety, if only I can think about the God that's described here. Of course, and on the first part of this chapter, we have the prophecies that are given, like verse 3 and 4. It talks about, John the Baptist. He's going to be the one that's going to bring hope and message to the people, crying in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. And we know that's fulfilled in the Gospels through Jesus Christ, preparing the way for the Lord. And the glory of the Lord shall see it, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord is spoken. And in verse 6 and 7, a familiar passage that is quoted in the New Testament as well, in 1 Peter chapter 1, where it talks about all flesh is grass, and all the loveliness like the flower of the field, and the grass withers, and the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. You can stand upon it. You can trust Him. He's given you and given us today His word. And we can trust in the word of the Lord because it will endure forever. But I want to talk more in this chapter about God. And we've talked about this now from Genesis 1 and looking at the evidences. Lift up your eyes on high and behold who has created these things. God is the Creator. And that's emphasized throughout this chapter. But let's go back to verse 12 here. This is an interesting verse. It says, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, measured heaven with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in a scales and the hills in a balance?" Now, in that one verse alone, we have 5 divisions of God's creation that ought to impress us with His greatness. You think about a God who has measured the waters in the hollow of His hand. I'm told that the mighty Mississippi pours 6 million gallons of water into the Gulf of Mexico every second. 6 million gallons of water every second. Or the oceans of the world contain like over 340 quintillion gallons of water. I don't know how they measure that. But whatever, to God is just like in the palm of His hand. And then He says He's meted out the heaven from the seas. We go to the heaven. He's meted it out with a span. And the span throughout Bible days, you remember, was kind of the measuring instrument instead of a yardstick or ruler, is the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger. And that's how they could measure something. This is a span, a little over 2 spans wide. Well, we talked about the size of the universe and how it stretches out. And now we can see just great distances through our new technology that's up there. And look at the billions of galaxies, billions of stars, and all the galaxies and stars out there. And we're told that the universe stretches out more than 30 billion light years. Not miles now, 30 billion light years. And yet to God, that great expanse, no matter how we view it, in looking up into the heavens, it's no more from here to here. I mean, that's all it is to God. But then from the heavens, we go back to the earth, which says He's comprehended the earth in a measure. And this denotes calculating or determining the exact amount. Like a man would measure a quantity in a measuring cup. To measure. And I'm told that the Hebrew word here denotes a third. A third. Now we know that today land covers about, over 57 million square miles, or about 3/10 of the earth's surface. But how did Isaiah know that the dust of the earth was a third 2,700 years ago? Unless, of course, he was inspired and it was revealed to him by God. And then He's weighed the mountains in scales, like you might weigh a bale of cotton or bale of hay. The estimated weight of the earth is like 6 sextillion metric tons. Again, I don't know how they figure that out. But it's the mountains. And, I was so impressed up to before I came up to Virginia, 14 years ago. I never had seen some of these mountains up here. Now, when we were in Alabama, we used to go to Gatlinburg and the Smoky Mountains every so often. We loved seeing those mountains, and we thought they were just majestic. And how could anyone ever get up, higher than this? And then we come up here to the Blue Ridge Mountains, and we're, oh, wow, this is just absolutely fabulous. And for the first few years, we were living in the Shenandoah Valley, and we see the mountains and, the Alleghenies west of us and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And, and now people ask us, well, isn't it just spectacular? Aren't you just overwhelmed? And we've been there so long now, we just say, yeah. And, but I really am. I'm still impressed with these mountains. But then a few years ago, I got to go to Colorado and saw the Rocky Mountains. And when you see those and you come back here and you think, man, well, they're still beautiful. But you think about how God made the world and the flood and Noah's flood and all the things that came about from that. And God was in perfect control and has formed the mountains and weighed the mountains like a person might weigh something in a pair of scales. And then it says he's also, I missed one. Well, it goes on, there's a fifth one there. It talks about the hills in a balance. And the balance here, I remember preaching my very first sermon, a long time ago. I got the opportunity to preach in Anniston, Alabama, at the little church, Ian Quintard, and there was a old brother there. He wasn't all that old at the time, but he has passed on since, but he was a pharmacist. And that was an old-time pharmacist. I mean, again, this goes back a long time. And so I remember going in his drugstore, and, he had that mortar and pestle and all, and he would grind up, the medicines, and he would put them in the capsules, and it's kind of fun to watch, and you don't see that anymore, do you? But that's kind of the way it is here with God. Like a man would weigh small qualities in a very delicate balance. And understand here, again, getting back into a little bit of science, that there's a principle here called isostasis, which means equal weights or perfect proportion. That is, the waters of the earth's surface, the land mass, and the atmosphere were created with the preciseness necessary to cause the proper gravitational and hydrological functions to sustain life on this planet. Forget all the big terms. What that is saying is God made it just exactly as it needed to be made. He's made it to perfection. And he is then the designer. Psalms 95, verse 4, whose hands are the depths of the earth, the peaks of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for it was he who made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. That's what every person needs to do in recognizing God as the maker and creator, and he's the designer. That when you look at the universe, and you look at our world, you look at everything about us, you look at even the most minute detail about our bodies, we see design, perfect design. That these things could not have come about through some type of evolutionary process, a random process, and accidental mutations, but there is order and design. There's one But the universe shows that design, doesn't it? I mean, you're walking out through the woods one day, you're just doing a hike, and you come across a watch. This old classic illustration from Pele, but, you think, well, there must have been all these parts that people have dropped out here through the years. Just different pieces of metal and whatever, and throw millions of years, all the things come together. If you find a watch or something like that, somebody had to make it, didn't they? Or the great pyramids, did all the sands of the great deserts in Egypt just come together over millions of years and gradually form these big monstrosities? It had to have a maker, an architect, and then a builder. You know, where did it come from? Like we talked about this morning, they talked about eternal matter, but then they said it came into existence by itself. And either God has always been or matter has always been. It's either mind or matter that has been eternal. Is it intelligent design or is it just random chance? John O'Keefe, astronomer at NASA, he says, "We are, by astronomical standards, a pampered, cosseted, cherished group of creatures. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in." There's something you can use on your atheistic friends. Show them some quotes like those. Or like George Greenstein says, "As we survey all the evidence, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency, or rather agency with a capital A, must be involved. Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon scientific proof of the existence of a supreme being? Was it God who stepped in and so providentially crafted the cosmos?" Paul Davies, a British scientist, says, "This is for me powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." And of course, there's many more quotes we could give. He was just 25 years old when he took off from Roosevelt Field in New York at 7:52 a.m. on May 20th, 1927. And after more than 3,600 miles and 33 and a half hours from home, he landed at Le Bourg's Field near Paris, France. When he had flown his trusted plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, midway on its Atlantic flight, he began to think of the smallness of man and the deficiency of his devices and the greatness and marvels of God's universe. Now, he was an unbeliever, agnostic, but he writes at that time and says, "It's hard to be agnostic here in the Spirit of St. Louis. When so aware of the frailty of man's devices, if one dies, all of God's creation goes on existing in a plan so perfectly balanced, so wondrously simple, and yet so incredibly complex that it is beyond our comprehension. There's the infinite detail and man's consciousness of it all, a world influence to what, if not to God?" Mr. Lindbergh just recognized what the psalmist said long ago, that the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Well, you know, God is the creator, but you know, God is more than that. He's in control of it all. If we go back to Isaiah chapter 40, what we find there in verse 15, "Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket, and are counted as the small dust on the scales. Look, he lifts up the isles as a very little thing. Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor its beasts sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted by him less than nothing and worthless." God is in control, and he sees and knows it all. And there's nothing that the ruling, superintending powers of this world do that they don't do it without his superintending, ruling supervision and providential workings. That God rules in the nations of men and sets up over those nations whomsoever he wills, Daniel tells us. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that the hard way. Belshazzar later learns that. God is in control. You thought you made it all. You thought you did it. You thought this was my mighty Babylon. But no, it belongs to God, and God put you in this kingdom. God set you up, and God can use the nations to his discretion. And after he's finished using them for his purpose, he can destroy those nations, bring them into judgment. But God is concerned about the nations, and he's in control. The old atheist Robert Ingersoll, he used to go all over this country and, preaching his evolution and atheistic philosophy and defying God. And on one occasion before a large audience, he said, well, if there is a God in heaven, then let him just strike me dead right here on this spot. Let him send down a bolt of fire or lightning if there's really a God up there. Somebody said that's just kind of like a little tiny fire ant, on a railroad track, saying, well, if there's the president of an L&N railroad, let him come down here and squash me right now. God's not threatened by any of that. And we need to see how just insignificant we really are before God. We read verse 17, all nations are as nothing. They're counted as less than nothing. That doesn't mean he's not concerned, doesn't care for the peoples of the nations of the world. But they cannot challenge his authority or his purpose. He may let them, we're going to read on. Let's move on to what he says here. Verse 21, 22. We read that a moment ago. Have you not known? Have you not heard? You've understood from the foundations of the world. Notice, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. Its inhabitants, we're insignificant, like grasshoppers in his sight. You think about the massive size we talked about, and I can't begin to comprehend that. So I don't expect anybody to be able to understand that or explain it to me, because how big this universe really is, and how many billions and billions of galaxies and stars and planets there are. But somebody once said, can you imagine me arguing with God, shaking my fist in the face of God, and here I am, just a tiny little speck on this planet Earth, which is a tiny little speck, within this solar system, which is a tiny speck, in this galaxy, which is just a tiny speck, we saw from the photo, and then it's a speck and a speck and a speck. Who am I to think that I can really argue with God or challenge his authority? It's good to see Millie here today. I don't think she's heard me preach in 25 years. But her dad, passed away the other year, and the top 3 influences in my life of preaching, he was one of them. And he's influenced so many men to preach. I remember when I don't think I was 14 or 15 years old at 77th Street congregation, when your dad heard me make a talk or 2, and he said, well, what are your plans? Do you plan to preach? And he put that thought in my mind. And I'm thankful for that encouragement. But one passage I used to often hear him use is Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And he did a much better job than me, but I love to hear him drive this home. In Ecclesiastes 5, it says, walk prudently when you go into the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and do not let your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven and you on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few. Said, I remember Brother Harold, I've heard him use that passage several times. And he could really put it well, how we need to recognize our place before God, and that we don't come before him challenging his authority or questioning his commandments or somehow defying his will. Who do you think you are When we come into the house of God, we draw near to listen. Don't be talking and speaking and thinking you have all the answers. Don't be rash with your mouth. Don't let your heart utter hastily before God. Remember that relationship between you and God, that God is in heaven. As John says, God is a man. God is God. And Job was a man. What's that passage? Didn't you use that this morning? I can't remember now. But you know the passage in Job where Job's trying to argue with God about that. Well, he's not a man like you, Job. He's God. So God is in heaven. You're on the earth. Let your words be few. And if we could just learn that lesson, that what we need to do is just to bow down, humble ourselves, and listen to what God has to say. Recognize His absolute authority. Well, let's look at verse 23 and 24. He goes on to say a little bit more about that when he says he brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them and they wither, and the whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. So again, God uses the nations just like He used Assyria as the rod of His anger. Later, He used the Babylonians to bring judgment upon His rebellious people in Judah. And God, I believe, Brother Homer Haley used to really emphasize that. He preached a lot from the Old Testament scriptures about the nations and how God raises up the nations, raises up the rulers, uses them and brings them down. And He says, this country is going to come down one day. God's judgment's coming on this nation. Brother Haley, we used to say, but right now there's enough salt in this nation, the salt of the earth, to preserve it. I don't know what God's will is for this nation or for us as peoples. There were a lot of good people, a lot of innocent, a lot of righteous people that suffered in the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and then later under the Romans in AD 70. There were Christians, there were good people there, righteous people serving the Lord faithfully, and they had to suffer. They had to suffer greatly. We may face that one day too if God's judgment, if He decides, and God knows when and where and how. We just need to serve God and continue to be the salt of the earth to the best of our ability and influence others by being that salt and that light of the world. And that's the only thing that's going to preserve us and preserve the nation. And most importantly, to get us home to heaven. But righteousness exalts the nation, the psalmist said, but sin is a reproach to any people. God is in control, and God is all wise. If we go back to Isaiah 40 there in verses 13 and 14, where he says, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, and who has, get to there, or his counselor, or who has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who has instructed him, and taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? There is no one, no power that can compare to the wisdom of God. And we see that wisdom demonstrated in His creation. As John brought out several things that I really appreciated this morning about Genesis 1. But you look at all that and you're impressed with the wisdom of God. I mean, who can teach Him anything? Who can impress Him? Who can impart to Him any kind of knowledge? And of course, the Apostle Paul uses that at the end of Romans 11 after discussing the salvation, the scheme of redemption for mankind, showing that all are under sin, showing that the only remedy is through Jesus Christ, not the law, is by faith and by grace. And he discusses all of that through the first 11 chapters of Romans. And then when he gets to the end of that, what does he say? Romans 11 and in verse 33, oh, the depth and the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. And he quotes now from Isaiah 40, for who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? And from Job, who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. That's just some of the most thrilling, exciting verses in all the Scriptures. And yet we read through Romans and we get to those verses and we read them like we're going to sleep. I just cannot imagine the emotion, the excitement that must have been in the Apostle Paul's heart as he wrote those words by inspiration. Remember, he's been discussing in great detail the salvation for both Jew and Gentile, and how it jeopardized his influence with the Jews and the Gentiles coming into the church, and all these complicated doctrines. It's all doctrinal stuff in the first 11 chapters, isn't it? I mean, doctrinal, but it's impressive, it's overwhelming. But then when we get to this, I mean, who can't but rather say, wow, the wisdom, the depth, and the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Well, that means God has all authority. And again, we just need to bow before him. And I think, as Brother Harold used to say, we just need to shut up and listen to God. And so he's got the authority. He's the maker. He's the creator. He designed it all. He brought everything into existence. He did everything for mankind. And we rebelled against him. We shunned him. We sinned and broke that fellowship and that perfect relationship. But he's made the way by his grace, his mercy. God is love. And so that's what Romans 1 through 11 is dealing with, and how sinful man can be saved. But it's only if we bow and submit to his authority and the authority that's given to us in his word. For that's the only way we can know the will of God and know what God wants of us and what to do to be saved. And then there is accountability. And as we said this morning, if there is no God, if the evolutionary process or some other theories come about to bring about the existence of man, then we just throw God out. And if we throw God out and there is no God, then we have no obligation to him whatsoever, and there is no accountability. You know, that humanism says man is the highest standard. Man is it. And I make the rules and I make the laws. And if you don't like it, so what? Because I'm the highest standard. Because there is no God. If there is no God, then who else can be the standard but the highest supreme intelligence on earth, which is man? And we don't have any accountability. I mean, do I really have to be accountable to you when you're nothing more than a man like me? Why do I have to be accountable to you? Why do you have to be accountable to me? It's being accountable to God. Acts 17, let's go to that. The accountability. And he says there, you know, again, verse 24, he told them about the true living God, the God that made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things. And I'm going to skip down here to verse 29. He says, therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature or the Godhead is like gold or silver or stone, or something shaped like art and man's devising. And truly the times of this ignorance God winked at, overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. So there's going to be a day of reckoning when we'll stand before the great Creator. And we will give an account of ourselves. So you can say no to God all you want in this life. You can claim to be the supreme authority, and man is the highest standard, and we make our own rules. But one day you'll stand before the Creator and give an account of everything that you have done in your life. Isaiah 66, 1 and 2 says, "The Lord, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build me? Where is the place of my rest? For all those things my hand has made, all those things exist, says the Lord. But notice, this one I will look on him who is a poor and contrite spirit and who trembles at my word." We need to recognize that supreme authority of God in his word. You know, the comfort is in knowing God. And you know, my last point here is, we talked about God as the creator and the wisdom of God and our responsibility to him, and that God is in control. But you know, God is concerned. He's concerned for each of us as individuals. And God makes providential care possible for us. He knows about me, and he knows about you. I mean, it does me a lot of good to know that God rules in the affairs of men, and he sets up over the nations whomsoever he wills. But I'll tell you what does me more good, and that is to know that God is aware of me, and he's aware of my needs and of yours. That what he says there in verse 26 of Isaiah 40, "Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them by name. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one is missing." You know, if you ever get down on yourself or down in the dumps or having troubles or anxiety and you don't know what to do, you can't find the answers, and you wonder if anybody really cares or if anybody can help, just get out there somewhere on a clear night where there's no city lights and just look up in the heavens and look at the stars. And if God knows each and every little star and cares about them, then he knows about me, doesn't he? And he knows about my troubles. And even the hairs of my head are numbered. And so consider the lilies of the field. Or consider the birds of the air. And if God takes care of them, he's going to take care of me. That's the great comfort we find. And then the closing words of this chapter that are truly powerful in nature. When he says there, verse 29. Let's read 28 again. "Have you not known, have you not heard, the everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator, the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary, but his understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might, he increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall." You know, we have a young lady who's a college student. She's a Christian that's worshiping with us. She's on the track team at JMU. And when I was preaching this the other week, I mentioned this verse, and I said, I'm sure that Virginia, I'm sure she never gets tired. She has a track meet all day on a Saturday, and that evening, I mean, she's just full of energy and not even the least bit fatigued. Well, we know that's not right, is it? You know, I envy young men that have all that energy and pep and zeal and drive. But, you know, that's going to get old, and we're going to begin to frail. But even young men, even the youth, they shall faint and weary. Young men will fall. But, verse 31, "Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." You remember those words from the song? I just love that song. 71, we were singing. That just contains the words from Isaiah 40, but the last verse, the third stanza, some will grow weary in the race, in trying to run that Christian race with patience. Some will grow weary, and sin they'll pursue. How sad and tragic it is we see those that once were so faithful, that were so diligent, that were pressing on for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, but now they've given up. They quit the race. And now they're pursuing the pleasures of the world. But the contrast, servants of God, their power He'll renew. You put your faith and trust and wait on the Lord. And let God's will be done in your life and submit to His will and to His authority. Then God will supply you with that strength and power, whatever you need to continue that race. And you can receive the prize, the reward that awaits for all the faithful. Lift up your eyes and see His great might. Soar like an eagle on wings of light. Let us never forget who God is, His character, His nature, and the power that He possesses, and that He is our God, and that we are blessed to be able to be His people. Again, thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you for letting me go first. I wasn't sure. I thought I might start getting sleepy about it after lunch.
I think it worked out great.
Yeah, well, I thank you.
Oh, that was so very good.
Well, I thank you.
Really appreciated the passages that you took us to, and I had forgotten for a long time Isaiah 66, 1 and 2.
I know,
So
isn't that,
stirring.
wow, isn't that a powerful
I know.
passage?
Love it.
You know, I try to use that as often as I can.
Yeah.
Because if only, you bring people and say, hey, now, I know you've got your religious views and you've got your opinions, but let's see what God says. Tremble at His word.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And chapter 40 of Isaiah, which is perfect. For you.
Oh, yeah, but
Thank
that's
you so much.
it's one of my favorite chapters.
Oh, mine too. Mine too. There are a lot of congregations have memory verses of that chapter.
Yeah.
They don't listen to it.
You okay?
I'm fine.
Okay. You couldn't get in a while ago?
What's that? Oh, that's your microphone?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to take it with me. Hey, John, you might need. Oh, yeah, thank you.
She's got a daughter who's
I
married.
really enjoyed your first sermon. I have to be at Quantico at 6:30.
Well, God bless
so we're
you.
gonna head
We'll
out.
see you again soon.
You never know what the traffic's
Absolutely.
gonna be like.
That's right.
Thank you for being here.
I'm sorry
Thank
we're
you.
gonna miss you.
You're fine. You're not missing anything great.
Will I doubt that?
Yes, they will be. Yes, they will be. It was nice to meet you.
So nice to
504. Do, so. Teach me, Lord, to lay down on my knees till in your own good time you answer my pleas. Teach me not to rely on what others do, but to wait in prayer for an answer from you. Teach me, Lord, to wait. My hearts are aflame. Let me humble my pride and call on your name. In my faith renew my eyes on thee. Let me be your wizard. Would you want me to be? They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Teach me, Lord, teach me, Lord, to wait.
Oh, it seems so long ago that 10 o'clock was when I first spoke. It's already 2:40. I'm going to echo the same thoughts of Brother Jim. It has been a joy to be with you here this morning. Some of you might know this, many of you may not know this, but Jim briefly mentioned the Belize connection. Talked with the brother over there just now about a connection from Belize. Belize is a small country in Central America. The population is roughly 350,000 right now. Our county that we live in has 1.2 million people. It's a small, small country. Nevertheless, over the years, since I was a young man, a young boy, I've got to know Christians from all over the world, many of them from North Alabama. Bobby Graham, we talked a little bit about him at lunch briefly. And it's just so amazing that you could go to a new place. It could be some hole in the wall somewhere in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, I don't care, or here in Haymarket, Gainesville, Virginia, and you meet brethren and you share connections. But more importantly, we share the richest connection with the blood of Jesus, don't we? Brother Jim said he's been trying to go to Belize for the last 15 years, is it? And I told him, I said this morning when he got up to speak after me that the church has invited the young men to preach here today. I said, well, you're still young, you can go. There's never a better time. Which, Brother Jim, I don't know how old you are, you don't have to tell me, but Bobby's turning 77 this year, and he's still kicking and going, so there's never too late of a time. Well, either this is the providence of God. When we had first communicated, Brother Jim and I, with Jeff about today and the lessons, I gave my 2 lessons that I wanted to preach, and I didn't know the order that was going to happen, and then Jim emailed me and said, listen, why don't you go first, and I'll take the 2 after that, you go last. And I thought, okay, that's great. And I'm looking at this lesson right now, what we're going to study, and I can't think of a better lesson that I would preach today than to end this way. This way. I'm going to invite your attention back to the text in Genesis 2. Remember that the account of creation formally begins in 1:1. It doesn't end until 2:3 because that is the 7th and final day. Now, in our first lesson, we established quite a few things and kind of a sweeping summary of the narrative, if you will. Now I want to focus on what day number 7 really means. And I would imagine that in most of our circles, a day like today, which for a Jewish person, a Hebrew ancient person, is the Sabbath, Saturday. I don't think that we think too much of it. For many of us, in the Western world even, Saturday is a day off. It's a day off from our long week at work. Harper's Ferry is not too far from us, so we might go kayaking, we might go horseback riding on some of the trails, we might take the bikes on the back of the truck, we might even spend some time with the grandkids. It's a day we enjoy ourselves, we relax, and Sunday's the first day of the week. And there's nothing formally wrong with that, do you know? That is in the Bible, that is the New Testament, that is the theology that is born out there in the New Kingdom. Nevertheless, may I suggest to you that we have very dangerously thrown aside the significance of the Sabbath. Very much so. Part of that, unfortunately, is because we're trying to divorce ourselves from denominations and some thoughts associated with that, and I think there's some wisdom there. But sometimes we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I think we do that with the Sabbath. Don't do that with the Sabbath. Genesis 2, verse 1, the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God completed his work and all that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day, declared it holy, for on it he rested from all the work of his creation. The NIV says in verse 1, the heavens and the earth in its vast array. As if we could ever really sum up the grandeur of who God is and what he has done. Great lesson last hour, by the way, about that. In our lesson this morning, we dealt with the account of creation. One of the points, the last point that we made, was how significant of a factor the number 7 is. We have to appreciate that number for what it is, and one of the places in the narrative where 7 becomes a key emphasis is right here, this last paragraph number 7, which in our English Bibles are taken up by these 3 verses. But interestingly enough, in verses 2 to 3, the first 3 lines each contain 7 Hebrew words. And the midpoint of each of those lines contains the phrase, 7th day. Now, you don't pick that up in the English, but that is clear in the Hebrew, which, of course, is what the Old Testament was written in and how the Jewish mind would have interpreted it. Moreover, in order to fully appreciate the creation narrative, we have to learn the significance of God's rest on this 7th day and how, as I said earlier in our morning, it shapes the rest of the biblical framework, God's sovereign will. Because remember, from the beginning, there's already an end bound up with it. A spectacular plan in the mind of God. How unfathomable it is, and yet truly life-altering. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on this afternoon. 3 points. Number 1, defining God's rest and the significance of the 7th day. Firm indications of the great significance of 7 is seen instantly in these verses. It lays the groundwork as such for its meaning throughout Israel's history. In fact, in subsequent chapters of Genesis, for example, Genesis 4, Genesis 7, if Cain killed, then Lamech will be revenged sevenfold. It's not the idea of literal 7, but you see this creation 7 pops up. When Noah takes animals into the ark, 7 pairs pops up there as well. Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years. Certainly, I think there's a literal sense in that, but I think there's a theological sense in that as well, bound up with the creation. In 2 verse 1, the work which God set out to begin in 1:2 is now concluded such that life is flourishing. Chaos has been ordered, and meaning has been given to that which was empty, indicated by those two rhyming Hebrew words we talked a little bit about this morning. The well-ordered whole is now complete, as God said in verse 31, indeed, it is very good. The seventh day, though, while it is clearly connected to days 1 through 6, it is the final day in this, we say, week of creation, it also stands alone by itself. It's distinct. For instance, there's no creative act done on this day introduced by the formula, then God said. That's dropped off. This day does not have a corresponding one like days 1 through 6. We talked a little bit about that this morning. Day 1 corresponds to day 4, 2 with 5, 3 with 6, 7 is by itself. There is no evening and morning closing denoting the termination of something. So that indicates a certain open-ended nature to this Sabbath rest, this seventh day, a kind of perpetual significance that will be borne out through the rest of the biblical narrative and even beyond that. From a theological standpoint, it is another hint that God, even here in the beginning, already has an end goal in mind. Nothing escapes the vastness of the God that we serve. It's not that God wakes up one day and he says, I finally figured it out, Jesus and Spirit and angels. I've got the end goal in mind now. Won't you celebrate with me? We think that way, but God doesn't. The end already bound up with the beginning, don't you see? The seventh day is the only day in the creation account that is blessed and sanctified by God. It is literally, specifically said to be set apart. It is holy in verse 3. God has blessed it this way, declared it to be this way. It is special to God. But why? Well, because God rested on that day. At one level, if you are a crass reader of the biblical text, you look at that and you think, oh, God must have been awfully tired. And he's gasping for breath and he says, oh, I really need a day off. Well, you and I think that way. Certainly, after a long week, we can't wait for our Saturday to come. But again, that's not the biblical view of God. So, to read the text as if though God is needing to catch his breath or recuperate his magical powers of some sort is to rather misread it. It is a purposeful decision that God makes to shape the rest of his plan in the Bible and human history, as it were. So the Hebrew word from which we get Sabbath literally means to cease or desist from something. But there's more to it than that. So Derek Kidner, in his commentary of Genesis, says, it is the rest of achievement, not inactivity, for he nurtures what he creates. Again, if we back up to our lesson from this morning, God is not a deistic God. That is to say, God doesn't create, and then he's up in heaven, kicking his feet up on his throne, not caring a bit what's happening with Mark Beans and John Pollard. That's not the God of the Bible. In fact, the God of the Bible is so great and so good, and yet so wholly involved in his creation that Matthew's gospel can say he knows even the very hairs on your head. However many they are, he knows. I don't, but he does. He rests, this rest of achievement. Certainly God has rested, he has ceased and desist, but may I suggest to you from a part of his plan. One part of his sovereign eternal plan. It is not indicative of an utter cessation of all activity. And one of the reasons we can know that with absolute certainty is in John 5. Where a text we will return to in our third and final point this afternoon, Jesus is healing somebody on the Sabbath day, and in his defense, the NIV says, he appealed to Genesis 2, and he says, don't you understand? My Father is still working. A present continuous tense. God had never stopped working, and they would not even dare levy an accusation against God. So why are you doing it to me? Do you see? So Jesus appeals to Genesis 2, and the point he's making is God rested, but he's still working. So it's not utter cessation. It's not God has given up everything, and now he's just off in retirement somewhere. This isn't that. This is, on one level, a part of his plan that is summed up in the account of creation that sets the cornerstone for something greater. That's why we can say from this morning, it's all pointing to Jesus. Again, we'll come back to this in due course. We're trying to build up to Jesus here in this lesson, but we'll come to him in due course. All building up to him. Everything finds its fulfillment around him. And he's still very much working, interacting. The Exodus, is there a greater illustration of that in the Old Testament than the Exodus? I didn't mention this morning, but when the people are going through the wilderness to get away from the Egyptians, and Pharaoh is in hot pursuit with his chariots, the people of Israel go, oh no, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die? Were there no graves in Egypt, Moses? And Moses said, just you wait and see what God's going to do for you. And the cloud that starts to follow with them, the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, it's so important in the Exodus narrative that when the people start to go and the Red Sea is going to be divided, do you know what the cloud does? The cloud moves from in front and goes back. And it makes a distinct separation between Israel and Egypt, as if to say, God is marking his people, and he's telling the Egyptians, don't you try to come in between me and them. Don't you see? God interacts with his created order. He's still working. He's answering your prayers right now. Whatever you prayed. You might have just prayed something. I don't know. You might have asked for something this morning. You could go home and ask for something later. You could petition God in some way. He's hearing. He's interacting. He's working. But on another level, this rest is indicative of peace. It's indicative of meaning and achievement that one finds in their work. One can rest even while working, and this is the rest to which God adheres to, providing a pattern for the apex of his creation to follow. So, for instance, when God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the Bible emphasizes that God put Adam in the garden to work it and take care of it. And God walked and talked with Adam and Eve. And since man was created in God's image and according to his likeness, it is not surprising to see that just as God works, man works. Just as God rests, so we do too. In various ways, at various levels. It's not always the same rest, but that rest can differ, don't you see? So the same thing is true for God. It is, after all, the pattern that we're following from him, in some sense. They had a kind of peace in the garden with God, a serenity that prevailed, again, not because the garden was so lush and the animals were so nice to them. Oh, nice lion, I'm going to pet it today. That's not what the garden is. What made it so peaceful, so alluring, tranquil, life-giving, meaningful is God was there with them, walking and talking, and more than that, there was no sin. Oh, there was no sin, not yet anyway. And that's why Genesis 3 becomes so horrible, so tragic, because the peace is shattered. The rest is broken. God's rest on the seventh day becomes a pattern for his overarching plan for his people. That is to suggest Genesis 3 will eventually show that where sin is, there can never really be true rest. So somebody has to take sin out of the way for there to be true rest. Again, everything ultimately pointing to Jesus. Number two, or second point, what did the Sabbath mean for ancient Israel, though? I think that's part of why we don't obviously celebrate it today. Are there any Jews here by heritage in the audience? Jews? No? We worship with one in Gaithersburg. I've met several Jews over my lifetime, and even then there's various different interpretations that have been passed down and so on and so forth. It's not been the same. It doesn't carry the same weight. What did it mean for ancient Israel? Well, first of all, there's no indication in Genesis that anyone kept the Sabbath law prior to God's giving of it in the Sinai theophany. Exodus 19:20. 24, the covenant is made, renewed later. Nevertheless, the words here in Genesis are actually the basis for that very law that is said in Exodus 28 through 11 in the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. It is repeated elsewhere in Exodus 31 and then Deuteronomy 5. There were several key reasons why the Sabbath was so significant. Let me give you 4 of them. 1, it illustrated that man is not to be overtaken by his work in the world so as to find fulfillment in his work. In other words, your work is not supposed to replace God at the end of the day. So it is not surprising that in the Torah, in the giving of the law, there are specific things stipulated concerning the Sabbath. Not in the least bit, keeping the Sabbath day every Saturday and not working on it. But there are also other things bound up with that. For example, in Exodus 21, you could have slaves. They work for you for 6 years. On the 7th year, let them go. You're observing a Sabbath in some sense. You're giving them rest. In Leviticus 25, for 6 years, sow your land, prune your vineyards, gather the crops, but the 7th year, the land gets a break. But that never happened. So when the Israelites are later carted off into Babylonian captivity, Jerusalem is destroyed. It's sacked. It's gone to ashes. 2 Chronicles 36:21 says, part of why God has destroyed Jerusalem and caused this havoc to be wreaked on it is 2 Chronicles 36:21, so that the land can finally enjoy its rest. Because they didn't do it the way God said. We said something this morning about everything in the creation narrative obeys God. That's true until Genesis 3. And then it is the most intelligent of all the beings God has made that blatantly rebel. It's horrific, it's tragic, it's disgusting. The most intelligent are the ones who have the audacity to say, God, would you excuse me from your throne? I'd like to seat myself on it now. That's what sin is at the end of the day. Henry Botcher says it relativizes, the Sabbath relativizes the work of mankind. It protects mankind from total absorption by the task of subduing the earth. It anticipates the distortion which makes the sum and purpose of human life, and it informs mankind that he will not fulfill humanity in his relation to the world which he is transforming, but only when he raises his eyes above in the blessed holy hour of communion with the Creator. That is why there is something so beautiful about starting a new week on a Sunday morning with Christians as we gather around the Lord's table to remember the man on the cross. For me, it helps to shape my week. It helps to bring my focus back where it belongs. The Sabbath did that for Israel. At least it should have. Secondly, the Sabbath reminded Israel that God completes his work. Days 1 through 6 cannot be finally completed and celebrated without the 7th. When he sets out to do something, he gets it done. My wife and I are pregnant expecting our first child in 2 months. That's exciting and scary. We have a crib that we got not too long ago, and I told her I'm going to set it up soon, and I will, but it's already 2 months away, and I haven't set it up yet. Now, if something were to happen and I didn't set it up, I know my wife would forgive me, but do you know things happen? I might say to Mark, listen, Mark, I'm going to come over one Saturday at your house and help you paint your shed. But something could come up and I can't do it. But you can't say that about the God of the Bible. When he sets out to do something, he gets it done. And to piggyback off of the song that Jeff led earlier, God will not get it done when you think he should. God doesn't work according to our timetable. He doesn't. But he works according to his perfect schedule, whatever that looks like, I have no idea. But he does, according to his sovereign will, what will eventually be to the most good. Waltke says, as he consummates his work in creation, he will bring to perfection his work in history through his elect people. He who calls Israel to bring salvation will not fail. He will not fail. 3, the Sabbath rest reminded Israel that their God is the incomparable, sovereign, omniscient, omnipotent God. I said those words fast, but essentially God is great. He is amazing. He is the God who rules and sustains all. Paul goes to Athens, and at Mars Hill, he says, in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. Waltke continues that it confesses their God is the Lord of all. That even if we are to concede of any kind of so-called pagan entities, the God of the Bible is utterly in control of all of them. Everything is finally dependent on God. To observe the Sabbath is to confess Yahweh as Lord, the great I am, the one who is the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the self-existent one. And finally, number 4, the Sabbath reminded Israel of the covenant. It is not a coincidence that the creation themes arise in the Exodus when God is making a covenant with Israel. That is an obligation between two parties, in some sense, a marriage, if you will, a binding contract. So it reminds them of the covenant that God made with them at Sinai, in which he released them from bondage. He brought them out of slavery. Have you ever been in a pit in your life for so long that you've just gotten to the point where it's normal and you don't think you'll ever get out of it? And when you get out of it, how does that feel? Boy, like you have a new slate. Like you're a brand new person. That's how the Israelites felt when they got out of Egypt. Sweet freedom, sweet relief. We can start anew. But God makes this covenant and reminds them of the Sabbath because he's about to bring them into a state of rest. That's what the promised land was. So that finally you've been reading Genesis, you read Exodus, you read Leviticus, you read Numbers and Deuteronomy, you read through, you get to the book of Joshua, and finally, in Joshua 21, the words occur in verse 43 to 45. God conquered all their enemies and gave them rest on every side. It takes a while. Do you see? God's timetable didn't happen the way they thought it should, but it took its time. But he got it done. He was faithful. But reminds them of who he is and what they're supposed to do in relation to him. Now, the question is, how did ancient Israel do with all of that? We just talked about what it meant. Boy, those were valuable things, right? But how did they fare? Well, I could just say it went bad and move on to the third point. But in the first instance, the initial generation that came out of the Exodus, some people I've heard this over the years, and I'm not so sure what to think of it, and I'm still not sure what to think of it today, but some people say, I don't understand how the people who walked through the divided Red Sea could do what they did to God. Yet I tell you the truth, I've been that stubborn before, and I will be that stubborn again. God has led me through numerous exoduses in my life, and I still spit in his face. It is the tragedy of sin. It enslaves us. It humiliates us. They came out, but they became so hard-hearted. They forgot the blessings of God. They were ingrates. And so God swore that they would not enter his rest. Psalm 95 talks about that. A psalm that the Hebrews author picks up. We'll come back to that later. The generation which entered God's land of rest, what happened to them? Eventually, they ended up forsaking him in favor of idols. Isaiah 40 is one of the greatest chapters in the whole Bible. But I regret it had to be written in the first place. Because it's written against the background of the Israelites who are serving idols. That's why there's so much comparison and contrast between God and the idols there in Isaiah 40. He has to remind them of who he is and how great he is and what he did for them. In later times, the Sabbath, along with other crucial festivals, listen to this, they simply became things to get over with. Are there spiritual things in your life that you're just trying to tick off on a checklist? I felt that way about some things before, if I'm honest. Brother so-and-so is in the hospital sick. I really don't want to do that today. My favorite TV show is coming on. I got it queued up on the TV, but I'm going to go do it anyway because I guess that's the Christian thing to do. Do we not reason that way sometimes about things, spiritually speaking? Be honest with yourself. In Amos 8, that's what the Sabbath was. That's what the New Moon Festival was. Oh, the Sabbath is coming. We can't cheat people now. We can't do the false scales thing anymore. We have to wait till Sunday. They just couldn't wait to get it over with so they could keep sinning. Did it get better? We talked about the captivity, that God sent them into captivity. That'll teach them. Yeah, that'll teach them. They come back. And there are two great books in the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, that talks about some of the great reforms that were happening. Ezra talks about the completion of the temple. And then Nehemiah says, I got to go back and rebuild the wall. I got to help get things back on track. And despite all the good, all the reforms that came from it, the last chapter of the book of Nehemiah ends so tragically. Nehemiah says, I came back after I went back to Persia. And what did I see? The people were now not wanting to get over the Sabbath. They were actually using the Sabbath to make money. And what you have to understand is they weren't making money genuinely. They were cheating their fellow man, robbing them, oppressing the poor. And Nehemiah closes his book and he says, God, remember me for the good that I have done. As if to say with one last gasp of his breath, I've tried. God, you know I've tried. We are, on the one hand, one of God's most intelligent beings that have ever been made, but on the other, we are good people gone bad. Tragic. So the Sabbath, it didn't really work out. Even still further in history, in later times, in